another thing. So today's session and today's research forum is entitled Managing the Metropolis, Spatial Sustainability, Women's Lives, and the Art of Noticing. Now, I'm going to be moderating the session, but I must say that this was conceived and designed by our very dear Antonella Contin, professor of the Polytechnic of Milan, and therefore I am really here to hold the space and the time of the four inspiring presentations that we're going to have and follow up with a few minutes of discussions. I'm probably going to have to leave just before the final panel session, but Antonella has provided us with a broad overarching question that I've pasted already in the chat, and Mike will probably hold that space for the last 15 minutes. Just a few words then on the purpose of this research forum, the core ideas. So the session is really intends to link the spatial sustainability with the role of women and links to SDG 5 and SDG 11 interest in the inclusive and safe societies that we aim to have by 2030. And the idea is to link spatial sustainability and role of women with the ongoing inquiry of the future of the metropolis that is at the heart of Heretopolis. So we're going to ask not only how to design the more equitable urban conditions, but also whose spatial experience should guide that design. So it's not a matter of only how, but who. So centering on living experiences, the four presentations will consider women as inhabitants, as observers and users of space, and as active agents in care, in memory, social relations, and everyday urban life. Within this framework, we will see how the art of noticing becomes both a critical lens and a design method. We're thus invited to attend to what planning and policy often overlook. So the rhythms of daily life, the thresholds and transitions, mobility patterns, fear and safety, access and exclusion, care, proximity, marginality, and visibility and belonging. If we foreground these dimensions, we're allowed to ask throughout the session three things. How improved living conditions might shape the metropolis of the future if the city were to be read through the lens of women's experience. Why women's spatial experience is crucial to understanding metropolitan life, and how can the art of noticing become a tool for design, interpretation, and policy. So Antonella has selected four wonderful speakers who offer very different research perspectives, reflecting on how women inhabited the metropolitan space, and how their ways of seeing, using, and interpreting form and space can contribute to more legible, just, inclusive, and livable urban futures. So with that broad opening, I would like to invite the first speaker. I have Alessandra. I don't know if you already knew the order. I have Alessandra, Adva, Archenda, and Maria Pia in that order. Is it okay for the speakers? Yeah? Good.
Perfect for me.
So let me start with Alessandra Pandolfi. Her title is Mapping the Metropolis Through Women's Everyday Spatial Practices. The contribution here is to position metropolitan mapping and urban-rural relations within the perspective of women's everyday lives. A focus on mobility, access to services, proximity, care networks, and visible and invisible labor. So, Alessandra, the floor is yours. Oh, good. You can share.
Yes.
Alessandra, I will wave at when you have 5 minutes left of the 15, I will just put up my hand.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, and thanks mostly for the presentation. That was very perfect. So Antonella asked me basically to try to understand how the women's everyday life and care networks can make a difference in the mapping that we actually have and in the approaches that today we have in the representation of the metropolis. So I try to explain what we do and how this women's perspective that we've been trying to highlight now since 2018 when we started working together can actually make the metropolis more readable, equitable, and livable. As I was trying to understand how to present this work and the works that we do, I started recalling about one of the theories that's at the very base of the conception about scientific production that was promoted by Karl Popper in the lectures that he held in 1953 about the idea of the words and how the words that we live, we test and we observe can actually influence the way we see and conceive the world. So, in the idea of Popper, that was a philosopher of science, there are three different kinds of words. Word number one, there is the word of existence and reality. It's the word of the physical objects. It's what he used to call landscape, but in an idea of landscape that is more closer to our concept of environment because it's something objective. It's something that refers to the actual um, reality, the objectivity of the reality. Word number two is instead the word of perception. So, how we perceive the word and how the same objectivity of the word can be different person by person, subject by subject. But even in a person's life, in the different times, in the different days, in the different moods and approaches that every one of us has. So, it's strongly connected to the concept of psychology, of cognition, of consciousness. And then there is a word number three that is basically related to how the knowledge and the scientific production, what could have referred at as overstructures of culture, can influence the first and the second word, trying to give a different idea of how the objectivity and the subjectivity of the word can significantly be influenced by culture, production, science, and all of those cultural features that can somehow give a different perspective on the word. So today we will try to see how the word number two of Karl Popper, so the word of perception, and the different approaches to perception, starting from the women's everyday life, can actually change the way we see and mostly we represent the metropolis, because women is recognized through history and through the history of representation as those that have a very different capability of noticing. So, realizing, seeing, defining details, highlighting those shadows, those nuances that sometimes are lost when we try to realize to represent the objectivity of the word. So the idea is that through the capability of women of highlighting those details, we can make the metropolis more legible, but also more equitable, because this capability of noticing nuances, of defining uh, different colors can help highlighting inequalities. So those small little elements that sometimes are more related to the perception than the actual objectivity of the word, but that can significantly create a different feeling towards the place in which we are, to try to support a more livable metropolis that is actually able to respect the needs of all the inhabitants, starting from the idea that this capability of noticing is actually a capability of revealing relations that usually are very difficult to be revealed, to be highlighted through the typical representation methodologies that we have today. We need to work with a technology that is the technology of the automatic cartography, of the geographic information systems, of the geodatabases, of the typical representation and the digital representation of the world, that even though is evolving every day through the artificial intelligence applications and so on, it's still not fully able to reveal patterns that define the everyday life of people, the everyday life of women. We know that the typical approach that women have towards the way they see the world is a relational approach, which makes the world slightly different in the shaping of the knowledge and the conception that is very typical of how the mind of a lady usually works. So revealing these patterns and the patterns that are happening in the everyday life of ladies can also mean trying to understand how the routines are built every day in women's life. Today we have a lot of technologies that can help us work very well, and actually absolutely we can try also to drive the technology that is very well developed today. We can use a lot of sampling methodologies, automated techniques that can help us using all the data and the details that can be collected real time through smartphones and other elements to try to map what are the routines and the actual needs of ladies. But the technology is sometimes not enough. We have to try to understand how to make the metropolis more legible, because making it more legible means recognizing the complexity that is behind this relational perception of the world that is typical of the women's mind and action. One of the possible techniques that we tried to use in this sense is the social mapping. What is social mapping? Is the construction of a map through the vision of a community that is called to express what are all the objective but also the subjective, so the perceptual features that can be highlighted in the different elements that make the spatial perception relevant for this community. Think about, as an example, the mind maps that can be built by the people that interact and act inside a certain area, defining which could be, as an example, those factors that make a place relevant for a community. We tried actually several different techniques to try to elicit these elements that make a difference in the spatial perception, trying to create relational maps that highlight which are the most important factors, as an example, in the care practices, and how, semantically speaking, those practices can be connected to the elements of the perception and the feelings and the psychology behind the experience of some of these places in the women's vision. This is the same starting point that, as an example, we tried to promote when we were trying to make the Metropolis more legible through the metropolitan cartography. So there is a recognized need of changing the way the word is represented, because yes, we have a lot of tools that enable us to create maps, cartographical applications very easily today through a lot of data that is made available very easily, freely. So we have a lot of the open source data that can be used to represent the word. But this is positive on one side and very complicated on the other side. It can become a very difficult element to manage, because as you know, having that many data and information can actually completely change the way we build a map, because it's not anymore a problem of collecting information. It's a problem of organizing it and representing it, selecting the relevant information to be introduced in a map inside a semantic environment that actually highlights which could be the real problems of a certain area. This was the aim of metropolitan cartography. So the starting point was really trying to understand how we can overcome the limits of the typical representation of the metropolis, highlighting the relations that determined the localization of some of the most important elements that define spatially the metropolis. This idea, this approach can be very useful when we are trying to make inequalities visible and actionable. In this sense, there is a lot of research tools, research experiences that are trying to highlight which are the gaps in the metropolitan spatial practices that women experience. As an example, studying what are the factors that determine the relation between women and public space, and which could be the approaches, the semantic terminologies that we need to try to introduce in the mapping of the city, to try to highlight, as an example, which could be the actual problems that affect women, and how these issues can affect the way they see the public space, or basically the way they're trying to adapt their public space through the needs that they feel, they see, they every day express. So this idea of mitigating inequalities is really powerful, because if we try to map the inequalities and map the sources, so what is actually defining the profile of what can be considered an inequality, we can try to collect as much information as we can, and then through techniques like collaborative social mappings, interviews, elicitation of perceptual factors, and so on, we can try to conceive a set of new spatial planning practices that can take into account how the perception of women can actually change the design strategies that we can promote, proposing a new design vision for public spaces as an example, but also for private spaces. This one here is an experience that was enforced in India, that through methods of elicitation of the perceptions of women inside the public space, tried to promote a new design vision and new planning strategies that can make the people change their approach to public space, trying to promote gender equality. So we have a lot of tools that can be promoted in this sense. What we're lacking.
Alessandra, sorry, I need to interrupt just to let you know your 15 minutes have passed. And my technique of
Oh,
raising my
sorry, I
hand.
didn't see the. Okay.
Yeah,
So
that
I
wasn't
will
it.
close very,
Thank you.
very
Sorry, sorry.
fastly. So basically, the idea was that we can use all these experiences to try to influence what can be the planning strategies and how these planning strategies can take into account the way these inequalities are distributing through the city, and then can be actually addressed through specific strategies that can be locally identified, like in the case of Milan, trying to make the metropolis more livable, and then using all this information that can be collected through these techniques to actually influence the planning strategies and how these strategies can be concretized differently through different design techniques. Sorry, I didn't see the
It's I should
waving. I didn't
adopt.
pay attention to it.
Yeah, no,
Sorry
I
for
should
that.
adopt a more voiced based approach.
No,
Thank you
don't worry.
so much, Alessandra. That was really wonderful and quite a lot of detail that we would
Yeah.
all want to hear
If you
more
want,
about.
we can actually share. I can actually share the presentation. So there are also some references, so to papers and other
That would be
possible
excellent. And I see
sources
Mike.
that anybody
Uh,
can find and read if they wish.
yeah. Right. I want to leave a few minutes for some questions or from the floor, requests for further details. I'm gonna open the floor. I can see Mike has already turned his microphone on. So Mike, the floor is yours.
Yes, I as I just like to ask, did you at all evaluate whether you would use space syntax theory as a method of mapping and adapting it for the subject of gender?
Yes, there are many possible techniques. Consider that we basically have a lot of methodologies that we can use today to map the city, to elicit, because the correct term is not the collection of information, but the elicitation, because when we're talking about perception, it's very hard sometimes to have the real impression of people. So it's not only a matter of making them express what they feel, but really make them elicit. So not only expressing what is as an example, the first impression, but also what is their deep feelings towards a certain place. So I think that depending on the purpose for which these maps can be made, because one thing is making a map that is representing the inequalities for planning reasons. One thing could be, as an example, making the same map for social or community uses. We can actually use many different tools. I strongly believe that the purpose defines the tool. So the final result that you want to obtain is what really tells you which kind of tools you can use, because today, luckily, we have a lot of tools. Technology is so well developed that in a few years, probably we will not even need to sample, draw, and organize data, because it will be the artificial intelligence that will process, collect, and organize the geodatabases. So it will become more and more defining then the way we choose the correct information, and then also the way we organize the different kind of data sets inside a certain mapping tool to obtain a certain result. Let's say that in a world in which the artificial intelligence will do more and more those activities that were a lot time consuming with a very little cultural support, today the actual cultural approach behind how a map is built becomes the very defining moment, because those choices that you can make, even semantically speaking, can really define how suitable the final representation result is towards meeting a certain goal.
Thank you. Jaromir, I see you have your hands up. I will take another question and then we have to move on because incredibly time flies.
Yep.
Jaromir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I really like it. I will follow the question about the space syntax, because I look at that analytical tool, which is the analytical tool always, and the design should be always done by us, yeah, by people. So we have analysis, but the perspective drawing, perspective thinking should be done by us. And I see a little bit discrepancy in the possibilities which we today have, thanks to the GIS and all that analytical tools, but the real life world of time of decisions, which are then political and let's say governance issues, which do not really fit, I think, with the flexibility and velocity of our analytical possibilities. So how do you think we can improve, or how we can put this into the practice? How to make it more like happens? Because one thing is to analyze, then the other thing is to prepare the proposal, and then how to really make it happen. Yeah,
it's
which always is like, which doesn't really follow the fast of the.
Let's say that
luckily, in 1 minute, if you can.
Yeah,
thanks.
Absolutely. Luckily, the technology is evolving, so probably the capability of analyzing and mostly updating the analysis will improve very soon. We already have countries that have updates about data that are very, very frequent. What will really make the difference is, as I was saying, the operator behind. So who is actually selecting the information? What is the priority given to the different data sets? And how these data sets are composed in the map, because this will drive actually the final decision making process, because we know that the cartographic representation, even though it's based on objective data, is never really objective, because it's a model, it's a modelization of the reality. So also the way you select the information, and you select some information and you leave out some other data sets, can make a lot of difference. So as I was saying, the purpose makes the tool, but it also supports the decision behind what you want to represent, how, and what you would like to give priority to. So it's still, once again, the operator behind that will make a lot of difference in this. So that is why also the correct education, the sharing of some ideas like we're trying to do today, can make a lot of difference, because giving consciousness about awareness about some topics to
Yeah.
professionals can really make a difference in how they give an outcome that starts from an analysis.
This applies to so much more in
Uh,
this day and age. But
Probably we would
thank you.
need 3 or 4 more research
Yeah,
forum sessions just to.
exactly. Just to cover the basics. But okay, I'm gonna regrettably have to play my ungrateful role of cutting people off. But Alessandra, thank you very much for sharing the
Thanks to you.
research. And I
I can
will
share
now
here the
leave.
presentation in the chat if you want, so everybody can download it.
I leave that to Mike. Mike holds the rules of the game, but let me then move on to the next presentation. This is Adva Mater. She is going to talk about From Garden Cities to Green Metropolises, Heritage Planning and Women's Living Conditions. And the presentation will explore how the relationship between green planning, heritage planning, and metropolitan development affects our living conditions, especially in terms of environmental quality, well-being, accessibility, and the everyday experience of urban space. Adva, the floor is yours. I'm going to try a new technique here. Let's see if it works. I'm going to fly a little balloon when, oh, it doesn't work. Never mind. I'll speak up at 10.
Do it on React.
Yeah, just tried,
Okay,
but
that's
it
it.
doesn't
Okay.
flow.
Okay, I don't know, but I'm trying to
No,
keep an
it
eye on
reacts on
you.
me. Yeah, you go.
Do you hear me well, everyone? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. I will present today, I would say, another part of the PhD that I've presented in last week's Paris conference. So apologies from everyone who's already heard part of it. I was trying to take a different the sets of parameters to look into, so I hope it's not going to be entirely boring. I've also not really managed to, I would say, develop it since the Paris conference because I was so busy. So let me just say this. I would focus more on the spatial sustainability aspect of this session and the art of noticing, hopefully. About the women's perspective, I cannot claim I unpack this in this presentation, but maybe we can develop it in, further conversations later. So, as mentioned before, this is part of a PhD. I'm currently finalizing at TU Delft in collaboration with Bezalel Academy, supervised by Daniele Canatella, Els Verbakel, and Anna Pereira-Roders, who you probably know. I am trying to see in this presentation today to look into the question of heritage boundaries as a limitation, but also an opportunity to sort of kind of address the question of how we manage them. Because if the assumption in heritage management is that the attributes we're trying to protect, the heritage attributes, are within those boundaries, or the culturally significant ones are within those boundaries, then what happens if heritage operates more as a landscape, like an ecosystem, and distributes itself across a landscape? And this is something that I think here, when we try to talk about heritage in Metropolis, we try to see heritage as a kind of spatial phenomena. Therefore, maybe also examining it as spatial phenomena would contribute to us a lot to the reframing or re-understanding of how heritage really operates in space, and then maybe actually see it from different perspectives, like well-being, women's perspective, etc. In this part of my research, what we did is we borrowed from ecology, from practices in natural conservation of mapping distributions of elements, and borrowing it into urban heritage attributes, and see them distributed across the territory. And sorry, okay. So this is not something that has been done up until today for urban heritage. I mean, borrowing the methods that look at whether a certain attribute is a spatialist, meaning very much concentrated, or a generalist, which means very much distributed across a space, has been borrowed from ecology to in different ways to biodiversity and a little bit to analysis of population estimations in other disciplines, but not applied to urban heritage, not in this way. So if an element is concentrated near the inscribed heritage, it would be a specialist species in its niche. If it's spread across the metropolitan field, then we would describe it as a generalist. This is the methodological pivot that we're using for this whole analysis. This approach has been applied to a specific case study, although it could be applied to others as well, and that is the century-old plan drawn for the Garden City of Tel Aviv. In 1925, Geddes has been providing the city of Tel Aviv a plan for its future growth. What used to be an extension for the Jaffa city has become at the core of a very, very growing, intensifying metropolis. And the planning principles which Geddes presented to that city were very much, first of all, based on a connection between the nature and culture, but also at various scales, between building scales and metropolitan scales as well. So this metropolis is providing us with a very interesting, I would say heritage case to kind of try to identify whether the original attributes has developed into a metropolitan phenomena. Here you can see the development from the White City boundary, which is the World Heritage boundaries of the inscription that is based on Geddes' plan for Tel Aviv, but you can see that it's also much more limited than what the original plan is, which is in the middle. And you can see how this is a tiny part of the core of a very growing metropolis. But because the original Geddes vision was at its very nature, it was regional, it was metropolitan, it is worth examining. So what we did is we analyzed the entire work of Geddes for Tel Aviv, which is a very long text, together with the evaluation of ICOMOS and the inscription text of the OUV for the White City, knowing that Geddes' text was much broader. The inscription is, of course, much more narrow. It combines various aspects that I'm not going to go into detail here because it's a different part of the work, but trust me when I say this, there is a shift between what Geddes envisioned and what was deemed as culturally significant in the end. It was much more architectural, it was much more limited because of reasons of integrity that I won't go into in detail now. But by reanalyzing the original vision, together what was ended up indeed into the OUV, the outstanding universal value, ended up in a list of 30 attributes that you can see on the right. What I call them the nature culture attributes of the real vision of Tel Aviv origins. And they themselves embody three distinct groups. I coined them elements, tactics, and objectives, because the first group of elements is much more tangible, it's much more concrete. Those are actually the building blocks of what should be the Garden City, according to Geddes. Tactics were in between the tangible and intangible, sort of short-term ways of how to operate and bring the city to its ideal Garden City performance. And objectives was the most intangible part of his work. These are almost values of the agenda of how the Garden City should operate. And today I want to focus on the elements. Now, I want to go much more quickly on the methodology, because as much as I would love to share with you the little details of our findings, I think for this forum, the methodology is much more relevant. So what we did is basically, and kind of I'm here giving a spoiler, what we did is we use a 1 unit of analysis of 1 on 1 kilometer cell grid to allow for this a more polycentric field to emerge. And what we did is we tried to, first of all, identify those elements on this entire metropolitan field. So the 10 elements that I mentioned earlier are rivers as urban nature. All these are derived as, again, from Getty's vision, but also they were also ended up as significant in the inscription. So they hold this, century arc between the original vision and what was inscribed. So rivers as urban nature, topographic high points that are served for fresh air and views, wild nature, the accessibility to it, unpaved trails, parcelization of gardens for residential blocks, that is to allow for gardens in the residential realm, urban parks, green boulevard system, so this hierarchy of boulevards leading to one another as green arteries in the city, the block garden, the gardening and agriculture in private and public space, so allowing that to the citizens, and public buildings with outdoor integrations, that is that a specific emphasis on the public facilities of the city. The three highlighted in this orange terracotta are the ones that I'm more interested in. You can see it in the next slides on how the results of mapping kind of more specific to these. But all 10 of those are, as I said before, are the building blocks of the garden city that combine within themselves they address both the nature and the culture. So we mapped those on the entire metropolis. We used the spatial proxies to map them using GIS, using open source data. This is also a limitation of this research. But basically, every spatial proxy that you define for each attribute you want to map, you map it on GIS. We rasterize the results because of the very fragmented origins of the various entities for each and every single map. We normalize and we classify the data according to two main gradients, the urban gradient and the heritage gradient. The meaning of that is we wanted to see whether attributes have any correlation. They distribute more or less. I will try to be more quick. Closer or further to urban areas and closer and further from heritage properties. And in that case, we used the entire heritage properties in the metropolis, whether listed on local, national, or international level. So in that, we wanted to hint whether heritage as a mechanism has the ability to protect even what is beyond what it's officially supposed to protect. So we ran the results of each cell value for each attribute and try to see the patterns of distribution across the space. And I want to go one by one very quickly. So in this case, you see that every spot, every dot is a cell, and it's colored by the attribute that it belongs to. I won't go too much into detail, but I would say this, that we see that 5 elements out of the 10 concentrate toward built-up area. So we see a correlation that the more they're closer to built-up area, the more they're conserved, the more that we see higher values of them. And 3 show tendency towards rural periphery. So in that sense, those elements that we identified in Geddes were much more urban than rural, or I would say this, they were conserved much more in urban areas across the metropolis rather than in rural. I will keep going. I will share these slides with you, so if you want, you can always go in detail later. You can see that all our 3 focus attributes of the parcelization of gardens stored in blocks, the public buildings integration with the outdoors, and the block gardens, all of them are indeed leaning to the built-up area. And this analysis was looking not on the proximity to urban areas, but to the specialist generalist spectrum, like I said before. So we can see that, for example, the public buildings integration attribute is the extreme specialist. This one is really concentrate in very few cells. And when it appears on high values. On the other side, we can see that parcelization of gardens in residential blocks is the only generalist. That is very important because it is very common to think that only the Tel Aviv core of the White City is the one that provides for green within the parcels. But actually, those same conditions appear in the entire metropolis in different levels, right? But this is not something that only Tel Aviv possesses. This is something that other cities and other areas can make use of in their policymaking in the metropolis. This is also to show you already kind of implementation mechanisms that we can derive right away from studying those patterns. Again, you can see here where our three focal ones are situated. I will go on. About proximity to heritage properties, this was more selective. As we said before, only 3 elements responded to heritage proximity, and most are indifferent. So we do see that in a way, heritage proximity shaped much more urban elements, but the natural landscape is, I would say, the elements that are more connected to natural landscape are not very well protected right now. If this is a kind of a quick, I would say, conclusion that I can derive, that means that the listing act is not enough. Drawing the boundary around heritage property is not enough. Apparently, the heritage properties in the rural areas helped us much less in conserving those attributes. So it's not just about the existence of heritage property, but also how much it kind of is integrated in the management of an area. This is just some kind of a grouping of how these 10 elements kind of on the matrix of urban versus rural concentrated and heritage towards concentrated towards heritage neutral. And I'm just gonna go into detail into those too much. Parcellation of gardens for residential blocks was the one that showed both concentrated in urban areas, and it's actually it's the strongest element on both gradients with a unique inversion. So it's present near heritage, but decreasing intensity there. So every correlation is something that can be studied and further, I would say, overlaid with the spatial conditions of the metropolis. And therefore, we can draw actual conclusions for each and every cell. I want to finish now because it's time is up. 3 main claims we can make out of this analysis. First, those elements that we identified for Tel Aviv metropolis, they are distributed bidirectionally. So we said 5 to urban, 3 to rural. It reveals that the physical landscape of the Geddes plain operates across the full metropolitan field, and not only within the described area, but in different modulations. Second, the heritage concentrates in the built fabric, not in the more natural landscapes. That because of the respondents, the low respondents to heritage proximity. That means that heritage shapes how residential fabric organizes more and not where nature persists in the case of Tel Aviv metropolis. That can give us conclusions to management of the natural properties in the metropolis, in the urban rural. And the last one is that together with the distributional profiles of the 10 elements, we can learn how nature and culture coexist and where they don't in this metropolitan region. So the method makes this, I would say, that character of the metropolis measurable, comparable, and transferable to any other, I would say, heritage property or heritage, I would say, a spatial heritage that is rooted in metropolitan landscape. Thank you very much, and I'm welcoming any questions.
Thank you. Wow, thank you, Adva. That was a huge rush on a phenomenal piece of work, I suspect. So you've made a courageous attempt to give us an idea of your work. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I want to give another 5 minutes now for questions. There's obviously plenty there. I mean, if there's one thing, Adva, that you can learn from these presentations is you're going to have a challenging time presenting in your discussion because you have so much material.
Yeah.
So this is good practice.
It is very good practice, and I'm very thankful for your patience.
No, it was lovely. Does anybody have a question for Adva? I have a curiosity in the sense that having missed the presentation in Paris, for me, this was the first time, and it is really quite an intense and dense material. So my basic question is, what inspired you to adapt the ecological lens, and how ultimately does it really help in your conclusions? Because somehow I lost the specialist generalist language throughout your 15 minutes. So it sort of caused me to wonder, did it inspire you to raise certain questions, but then did you abandon that language, or is it just the way that it was presented today? Over to you.
That's a good question. I would say this. I would start with what inspired me to do this. I mean, GIS mapping is nothing new. But it was applied in many cases in our field of heritage in a very concentrated way. So first we defined the boundary, then we mapped what was within it. Or sometimes we did the other way around, but we were already biased by the boundary. It was really a need. I mean, we had the set of attributes by Geddes. We knew that he was envisioning them because he said so on much larger scale. And we know from literature and we know from practice in this metropolitan case of Tel Aviv that the entire region was very much influenced by this planning. But that is to say, I think that is this is the soul of the metropolis. Nothing is bounded. There's always this spatial exchange and spatial influence. And the moment where we realized that there is this layer of shared spatial features in the metropolis, but it was never been mapped and it was never been I would say considered as culturally significant, because the moment the World Heritage inscription took place, that's it. It's like we all accepted that this is the only place where those attributes appear. So we had to adapt both the scale, but also we had to adapt the methods. And we couldn't find in urban heritage methods that were vast enough and were looking into spatial patterns and distributions rather than just mapping what there is, because we couldn't define from the beginning where those attributes appear, because that would be biased. So our ways of measuring separately those attributes and then using those OSM methods from natural conservation and the distribution and specialist generalist, I would say,
Divide, yeah.
this is how we kind of overcame our own bias as well. And we're literally bridging methods from both urban conservation and natural conservation. And if we want to be able to do this cross-disciplinary and look at nature culture, then until we find a better word, Mike, at least we can combine the methods.
The methods,
so,
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I really look forward to reading this work. Is there anyone else who has questions for Adva? Or is everybody like me waiting for the publication?
Everyone is shocked.
Have you already published something, Adva, or you're waiting to?
Yes, I've been publishing, I would say, the preparatory work for that. So the analysis of Geddes. I go into detail there. I mean, it's on the process. I hope that it will be published in Built Heritage, the special issue of Metropolis. So when this one comes out, and if I publish there, then you'll be able to read the deeper analysis of that. And the second part, where we tested those attributes in other cities in the metropolis to see whether indeed policymakers identify those attributes or some of them within their cities. This was a publication that we just got out in March in Land. So I can share the link here.
Please share. Yes, if you don't mind, that would be really helpful. And I personally will be very interested to compare that.
Can I just say, first of all, I just put in the chat, I think that paragraph 83 of the operational guidelines, speaking about spirit and feeling, I think this is an amazing attempt by ADVA to actually help the analysis of these attributes. I think that's important. And I know that some of the work of the Metropolis of Prague, which I have had the opportunity of sharing, also have tried also to look at these aspects as well.
Thanks, Mike. Okay. Adva, thanks for putting the link And again, I need to rush to the next speaker. So again, thanks, Adva, and congratulations and good luck for the last stretch. And now I am turning to Arxenda. Arxenda, I'm hoping I'm not mispronouncing entirely your name. I suspect I am. But so you'll be talking about in between boundaries, diffused metropolitan centralities, and women's spatial agency. And we're hoping to see some reflections on diffused metropolitan centralities that can be framed as a reflection on how women inhabit and transform intermediate spaces, borders, thresholds, mobility nodes, and places that are not fully central, but are essential to our daily life. Over to you, and I will try to speak
Thank
up
you.
when you're 10 minutes in. Thanks.
I don't know how to share the entire, but
Can you share the screen or is it not collaborating?
so
There you
I
go.
will try. Can you see it? The presentation?
Getting there? Oh.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we can see your black screen.
Okay, wait, I try again. Okay, I think I got now. Oops. Just one moment. I am losing some time now.
An hour and a half flies.
It's not letting me. Just one moment.
Can you email us the presentation maybe if, I don't know.
Because the button is not working, so I will try to.
You mean the share button?
Yes.
That you should have.
Okay, let me try to add it.
Perhaps we go on to Maripia and then you can send it to me on the email and I can then share it.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that then. So Maria Pia, is it okay if we call you? Yeah, we put you on the spot. Great. So Maria Pia is, her presentation is Heritage, Community and Livability, Women's Experience in Historic Metropolitan Spaces. And she's going to address livability in heritage cities, showing how community, memory, dwelling, and care for space are central to imagining the future of our metropolises. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Hi, so good afternoon, good morning. Thank you to those who spoke before. That was super interesting and quite big shoes to follow. So today I'm going to talk to you about, yes, heritage, community and livability, but looking at the women's experience in these historic metropolitan spaces, but particularly looking at the art of noticing as kind of one of the themes of today's research forum. And so I'm kind of moving away from my actual PhD research and looking at something that I observed during this process. And I want to think about heritage not just as something preserved or protected, but how people's everyday experiences and of heritage and living with that heritage can help us think about livability in the wider metropolis. I'm gonna start by we'll kind of work this presentation around this image of the basket hanging from the traditional Maltese balcony. It's often women would lower these baskets to the street below them, and the greengrocer would put in the groceries and they could lift the basket back up to their apartment. And it might at first glance appear picturesque or vernacular, or simply like something that belongs to like the local folk culture. But I want to kind of look further into this gesture and see it as a spatial device and how it shows that daily life is organized by the architecture of the city, the proximity of the community bonds, dependent on other people and neighbors, visibility or invisibility. These galleries were kind of at first designs from spaces where you could see the street without being seen yourself. And in fact, in Maltese, we still have a verb, syndicao, and it's when old Maltese women stay on their balcony and peer through the windows, hoping that no one sees that they're spying on the street. So yeah, this idea of visibility and invisibility, but also like structures of care and how it's influenced by the physical fabric of the city. It shows how women kind of often inhabit this liminal space between the domestic and the urban, the private and the public, the home and the street. And the kind of the broader question is, how does the women's lived experience of like thresholds specifically in heritage spaces inform more livable metropolitan futures? For those of you who are unfamiliar with Valletta, let me provide a brief context. Valletta is the capital city of Malta. It's a fortified city conceived by the Knights of St. John in the 16th century, found on a small peninsula in between the two main harbours of the island. And it is one of Europe's smallest capital cities, and it's part of a wider urban sprawl, but Valletta itself has its own kind of identity within that. It also has a population in decline, which is why I'm using a picture from Facebook, a group called Nostalgia Malta. I've wandered the streets several times in the past month trying to get a picture of my own. But the practice of this, lowering your basket from the balcony, is in decline. Valletta itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site inscribed in 1980 as an example of the late Renaissance planning and its close affiliation with the Order of the Knights of St. John. And despite it being a place of change, it's very much legible still as a city designed and conceived as this fortified space for a military order in the 16th century. And yeah, even heavy bombing during World War II, you can still see in the picture the kind of the gridiron streets and the bastions that surround it. A phrase that's often encountered with Valletta, you hear people say it, is it's a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen, or a city of palaces built by gentlemen for gentlemen. And there are most of the architecture is Baroque palaces that were built for the Knights of St. John. But I think it's quite interesting to mention this phrase, especially today when we're kind of talking about the role of women. It's helpful to remember that Valletta was, in fact, not designed for women or by women. And it also has the implications of being a heritage site, UNESCO World Heritage Site. We often kind of focus on preservation or conservation. We think of like the listed buildings, the facades, but obviously since the Faro Convention in 2005, there's been a paradigm shift in heritage discourses, moving away from the expert-led, material-driven, focused understandings of heritage, where recent scholarship has emphasized more about heritage as being something embedded in the routines and practices of everyday life. Rather than being encountered only through formal designation, it's more about how people engage and their ideas of routine, as Alessandra was talking about patterns of routine. And that's more how we talk about heritage now. This kind of idea of familiarity and observing practices of familiarity help us see the importance of the heritage within the city beyond kind of authorized frameworks. It's not only the material survival of the past, but it's the way the history forms and shapes the present. In Valletta, this is easy to see because of the balconies that lead out onto narrow streets, the dense urban blocks, and the gridiron layout, the steep topographies that lead down towards the sea. There's a strong vertical relationship that's not simply architectural features, um, or it's the architecture itself influences the way people live, and it's not just a background to their lives, it is one of the conditions in which they have to live or social life is organized. The UNESCO's historic urban landscape approach discusses, I believe it's Article 3, that urban heritage, including its tangible and intangible components, constitute a key resource in enhancing the livability of urban areas and fosters economic development and social cohesion in a changing global environment. But oftentimes, especially in the Maltese context, they're focusing on the economic or environmental, but less on how we can observe and learn from social sustainability within those contexts as well. Yeah, balconies are, going back to the idea of the balcony, it's a permeable space between the public and the private. And if you stay and observe for long enough, you might eventually find the women lowering their baskets. And the yes, women are I'm losing my words, I apologize. But women are often the mediators between domestic routines and neighborhood networks. And what I mean is looking at this example of the basket being lowered down from the balcony, you're seeing how one, it's evolved from need. Women are often the ones doing the caring. They are carrying the babies and the pushchairs up 4 flights of stairs in buildings that you cannot put a lift in because of this UNESCO World Heritage status. It's very difficult to put lifts in the domestic spaces. But if you watch how women have adapted and learned from that and how they've shifted, and that's just by observing, we can start to see other patterns. It's while Valletta was designed without women, if you observe them in that space, you can start to see ways in which the city has become livable, how women have adapted that experience. And also looking at kind of community ties and networks. Women have to, like, when you lower this basket, you can't just lower it. You need to have a community network built around that as well. You need the greengrocer to know that you want a dozen eggs to be placed in the basket and for them to know that you're going to kind of lower it down at 10 o'clock. So it helps us look at those patterns as well by just kind of watching and seeing how people have adapted to the space. And that's kind of talking about the art of noticing and why I'm not really looking at kind of the results of my thesis, the research that I've been carrying out. When I spoke to people about what they understood between heritage and livability in Valletta, it tended to be kind of bigger things. It was never really gendered, looking at women's experience. It was mostly about parking or the local council. Two things about women came out, and that historically women didn't have a social space, especially if you were from a higher socioeconomic background. Those spaces were more for men. And the other interesting observation was that the only statue in the city that is a woman is Queen Victoria, and the tension is between the colonial images of Queen Victoria in Malta versus the fact that it's the only statue of a woman in the space. But that didn't look at how the actual physical fabric of the city influenced women and their how that affected the day-to-day life. Yes. So going back to the idea that or kind of linking this all together, the urban environment and the structure of the buildings in Valletta may help us understand that accessibility becomes a basic urban concern between levels. It disproportionately affects people with disabilities or women. And just watching them and how they interact with the space can help us learn more about the space itself. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of talk about, well, obviously Valletta isn't a metropolis. How do we expand beyond this? And the idea is that, well, this context of baskets being lowered isn't unique to Valletta, is one way of looking at it. Thank you to Mike for sharing this picture with me. But it's the idea of okay, I've noticed the baskets in Malta by watching, just standing and observing and noticing. But how can we extrapolate that into other scenarios? This method of noticing isn't applicable only to the Maltese context, but rather to wider contexts. Going back to the basket, yes, this can be seen beyond. So heritage can be a useful resource through the art of noticing and the women's experience in the city. We can stand and we can watch and we understand how the urban fabric itself can, and how people have adapted to that, and how that can inform us about livability and practices of livability. I'm going to end there. Thank you for listening to my quite garbled thoughts.
Thank you, Maria Pia. No, that was wonderful and very poetic. Thank you. And perfectly on time. So 5 minutes, and then I will pass the baton to Mike. Mike, I've left you a little note in the chat. Any questions for Maria Pia whilst you think? I have to tell you that I am going to make an effort to send you a photo from Lisbon, because there are plenty of baskets going up and down in Lisbon, or at least there used to be. I'm afraid it's like you, it will probably be harder now to find, but we are equally challenged. No elevators in the old center, lots of old people living in the old center, etc. So you're not alone. Any questions for Maria Pia? I have a question in terms of being a bit of a policy-oriented soul. Is there any plan to write this up in a way that at least can move our policymakers and planners to notice, if not solve, at least notice in a different way? Do you have any plans for that?
I would like to. Obviously, my thesis will kind of touch upon other issues in the same way without necessarily just looking at the art of noticing. And I hope to have it eventually published, especially at least in the Maltese context for Maltese local planning, because the focus that I had was quite specific to the site. Unfortunately, Valletta tends to have a focus towards, or the Maltese policies generally tend to focus towards and development. So they're building outside of the city, and those buildings are modern and they have lifts. So this kind of issue would just be seen as something, it's a quirk of this place, and it's, whatever. They tend to privilege still the kind of development over the looking at what we have and how we can improve that and how we can learn from that when we design and develop, if that makes sense. An answer to your question.
Yes, though I can still see a 4-page so-called policy brief as an almost a provocation that could become a little movement around baskets and the art of noticing, which was a great title as well. Yeah.
Well, we thank Olivia for that, and I'm sort of taking over the baton. So I've just put in the chat Article 5 of the World Heritage Convention, which is the first 5A, is that it's not to have put sites on the list, but it is to adopt a policy to give cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the communities. So I think that what you've done over there is really something to highlight this aspect of putting it into life of the community, and not looking at sort of like outstanding universal values with it, whatever it is, with all that it means. Anyway, okay, so we're moving on to Algenda. If you can share it, I'm the backup now.
Yes, I will try.
She is also at the Politecnico di Milano, in between boundaries, diffuse metropolitan centralities and women's spatial agency. So the screen is yours now.
Okay, let me give a try if it's working. I see that's not really. So I will need some help with the backup.
So you want me to do it? I can.
Okay. So going from the, well, the title has changed a little bit.
Oh.
It's actually Metropolis as a practice of noticing women as spatial diplomas in the metropolitan condition. Mike, the screen is still not being shared.
Don't know what happened there. Share. There it is.
Okay. So what if the future of Metropolis is not designed from above, but it's observed, interpreted, and negotiated from within? For a long time, we have approached the city as something that can be planned, organized, optimized through systems, policies, and large-scale strategies. But everyday life in the city does not happen at that level. It unfolds movement in routines, in moments that are often too small to be captured, yet essential to how space is actually lived. And what if the transformation of the metropolis does not begin with control, but with attention? And what if this process begins from the lived experience of women? Today, I would like to reflect on how.
Tell me when I have to move the slide.
Yes. Today, I would like to reflect on how we can rethink the way that we understand and transform metropolitan space. And not by starting from predefined solutions, but by reconstructing the perspectives from which we read the city. In this sense, I will bring together these three dimensions. The first is the spatial sustainability, not only as an environmental concern, but as a question of how space supports everyday life, relationships, and long-term resilience. The second is a women's lived experience, not as a separate category, but as a way of reading the city through care, movement, perception, and negotiation. And the third is the art of noticing, so a way of paying attention to what is often invisible in planning, yet central how the space is actually lived. And together, these three dimensions allow us to shift from designing space as an object to understanding it as a lived relational condition. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that this reflection is a part of a research direction I am currently developing, so it's quite new, in the field of science diplomacy, with a focus on designing inclusive cultural infrastructures for transnational communities. This work begins from a simple observation that many of the challenges we face today, whether social, spatial, environmental, cannot be addressed within a single discipline or within a single institutional framework. They require forms of knowledge that can move across scales, connect different systems, and this is what this diagram begins to illustrate. A relational understanding of the metropolis, where spatial layers and social systems are deeply interconnected. In this sense, the science diplomacy offers a way to understand how knowledge, institutions, and society interact. So not only to produce policies, but to actively shape space. Within this direction, our architecture and urbanism are not understood only as design practices, but as mediating tools that translate between a lived experience and institutional frameworks, local realities, and broader strategies, where everyday life and long-term transformations happen. In this way, the design becomes a form of translation across systems. And today, the metropolitan condition can no longer be understood only within the boundaries of a single city. For many people, space is not experienced in one place, but is a movement that unfolds across multiple territories, between countries, between systems, between identities. And these are transnational lives that are lived in between. So not fully here or not fully there, but constantly negotiating both. So migration in this sense is not only movement, but is simply a transition from one place to another. It's an ongoing condition, a way of inhabiting space through distance, through connection, through adaptation. And this condition is increasingly shaping the way the metropolis is lived today. So if we go to the next slide, we see that while these realities have expanded across borders, the structures that organize space have not. Policies, institutions, and planning tools remain largely fixed. They are still defined by national boundaries, by administrative limits, by sector-based approaches. In other words, they are designed for a different condition of space, a condition where life was assumed to happen in one place, within one system, within one framework. And today, lived experience moves across systems while governance remains fragmented. This creates a structural mismatch between how space is lived and how it is organized and managed. And within this gap, the lived experience becomes invisible, not because it does not exist, but because it cannot be recognized within existing frameworks. So the question is no longer why or how we design the better spaces, but how we begin to recognize and make visible the realities that are already there. So if lived experience remains invisible within the existing framework, the question becomes, how do we begin to see it? This brings me to the idea of the art of noticing. Noticing is not simply observing, it is about looking at a space from a distance or describing what is already visible. It is an active, situated form of attention, a way of being present within the space and recognizing what is often overlooked. Noticing allows us to perceive the rhythm of everyday life, informal practices, temporary conditions, subtle transitions between spaces, and the emotional dimensions and how the space is experienced. These are not easily measurable by elements, but they are fundamental in how a space actually works. And this is where women's lived experience becomes essential, because what we describe as noticing is not something abstract. It is already happening, and it is often practiced through everyday life by women. Through daily routines, women continuously engage with space. They observe, interpret, they adapt, they respond, not from a position of control, but from within the conditions of the space itself. They move through the city while negotiating multiple layers at once: safety and exposure, proximity and distance, care and mobility, visibility and invisibility. In doing so, they develop a form of spatial awareness that is highly complex, but rarely recognized. This is not simply an experience, but this is a form of knowledge. Mike, if you can go to the next slide, it's a video. You have to share also the sound, the voice. We cannot hear it. Probably you have to stop sharing and share it again with the voice. Mike? Okay, we didn't see the video. I don't know if the rest saw it.
Never understand the context.
Doesn't seem to. Oh, where?
No, we couldn't see the video.
So what should we do?
Yeah, now it's good.
Je t'ai cherché partout.
Okay. So what emerges from this experience is not only a narrative, it's also a mismatch, a distance between how it's represented and how it's actually lived. What we see here is a conventional reading of the city, a map of the green-gray infrastructure. It shows systems, networks, distributions. It is precise, it's measurable, it is legible, but it remains incomplete because it does not account for how space is experienced. It does not register hesitation or avoidance or adaptation. It does not capture the continuous negotiation between safety, exposure, between proximity and distance, between visibility and invisibility. So what we are looking at is not wrong, but is partial. And what is missing is not data, it is perspective. And this is where the additional layer emerges, an invisible layer. A layer constructed through movement, through perception, through lived experience. A layer that does not replace the map, but reveals the limits. If you can go to the next slide. So what we have just seen is a way of experiencing space that is rarely captured, a way of moving through the city. So between safety and exposure, between all of these elements, these decisions are not random, they are informed, they are precise, because women continuously negotiate the space, but often they are without a formal recognition. They are based on a continuous reading of the space, and yet knowledge rarely enters. It processes through which we design and decide, not because it does not exist, but because it's not recognized within the existing frameworks. So the question is not only how to represent the experience, but how to integrate it into these systems that shape the space. If we can go to the so in this research direction, I drew the quintuple helix model, a framework that understands the development as an interaction between 5 key domains. And together, these domains shape how knowledge is produced, how decisions are made, and how it's transformed. It is a model that moves beyond isolated disciplines. It recognizes the need of coordination across systems, and it allows us to understand the way that Metropolis works. But even without these layers, not all actors are equally recognized, and in particular in those forms of knowledge that emerge from lived experience often remains outside the structures through which decisions are made. If we can move to the final slide. If we look at the system more closely, we begin to see that women are already present across all these domains, in institutions, academia, in the economy, in society, and in the way that we relate to the environment. They are not outside the systems, they are embedded within it, and yet their role is within the system that often remains informal, unrecognized, and structurally excluded from the processes through which decisions are made. Women are actively shaping space, but are rarely acknowledged as actors within the systems that define it. Their knowledge exists, but is not translated into institutional or spatial decisions. So the issue is not absence, it is recognition. And one more. So women as a spatial diplomat. And if recognized, and if women are recognized within this process, the women can be understood as spatial diplomats, not in formal or institutional sense, but through everyday practices, through the way they move across systems and translate this into action. They operate between different layers and translate, because what they are doing is a form of mediation, a form of translation between environment, constraints, and possibilities. And these processes operate between these layers, which are safety and exposure and all the elements that we put. And in the end, they are able to become the special diplomat. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me just. Thank you. Well, we have just like 5 minutes to ask some questions. I've got a question. In looking at spatial diplomats, what is the difference between male and female diplomats? I don't. Isn't it the same? Why can't I be also a spatial diplomat?
We are talking about decision makers. So we do have a lot of male decision makers in the system that are existing currently. And what I mean about right now in the presentation is more like to include women in decision making. So because of all the elements that they are able to perceive, that we already added. And if we have those, then of course it can be. And so it is a role which probably exists within the male domain mainly, but we are trying to also put the female in decision making.
Okay. So, any other comments? Anybody's willing to back me up? Go. Eleanor, are you
Yeah, I'm emotional about this. Thank you so much for each one of the shared things, but this last one was especially especially wonderful for me. It says something which is important, and it is about things that are not the missing things. I believe that anybody, any group could have this very important role of being diplomats. So, and it is to me the whole topic, the whole thing is not just about women. Women are a case women are just a case of being different and of respecting differences and of being sensitive to what the differences are, because that's something we need to be aware about, and it's a point of educating this sensitivity. Well, women are important, I agree, but women are different, and when we speak about women, we also need to think about different roles. Cultural context matters. In Bulgaria, we have more women probably at the local level of governance, and they react differently from men, not because they are better than men. It is just because they have other senses to the detail, to the granular experience of things, which is not the only experience we need to have, because sometimes men are better in strategic thinking, so it's not about dividing, it's about being able to integrate to get this holistic picture, not picture, it's dynamic
I'm,
world.
Auzu, you're a guest. You would like to make a comment?
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a big pleasure for me to be together with you. As I wrote, I am from Turkey. I thank for every presenter for their presentations and interesting topics. We have nearly the same discussions in our country, which is in between East and West, and challenging many problems, as you know. I wish all of them, success in their future studies. I have no question. They were all very interesting and also understandable for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Any other comments or specific or looking at the whole group? Is there some other comments? I think that what Antonella wanted to sort of bring to the table is that in fact gender, and I did put on that little poster which appeared in the United Nations, which I don't know, what did it have? Yes. What if women design the city? This was in the United Nations. I think I can't remember exactly when it was, but nevertheless, it really highlighted. And I think I share what Eleanor was saying. Is in fact that we must bring other voices to the table, and that's what's so important. It's the other voices and exactly how we do that is really critical. And so than the group of people, it might be voices of different age groups, it might be voices of different cultures, it might be voices of different genders. But I think that the principle of it is that we should be looking at eye level at people and about bringing these voices to the table. Klaus Peter, you haven't said anything today. No.
Okay, I think what I really agree what Elena told us. I think it's not a division between men and women, but they should engage, and everyone has a little bit something special, and to bring this specialty in our heritage business, and also, of course, in decisions of urban planning. That's very helpful.
I think that Alcenda, that it was very, very interesting that the different approaches, and I think it's some similarity with ADVA in trying to then analyze and understand then the spaces and the activities. ADVA, you want to react to some of the slides which were presented, which to my mind really relate to some of the approaches that you've taken on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I was especially intrigued by the continuous, discontinuous aspect woven into, I mean, I call it attributes, but can be dimensions or anything else of the metropolis. So I think this is something that could really relate to do what we really deem as continuous. For example, public transportation is really, in fact, in the space is really continuous, or is it continuous to certain communities, and for others, they're actually feel the discontinuous aspect of it. For the case of the Tel Aviv metropolis, I could 100% say that it is discontinuous, even though policy documents think it is otherwise. And one last comment, if I may, is that I remember back when we used in Bezalel to work with Urban 95, cities from kids' point of view. So the message was always about that we're trying to adopt the children's point of view when designing or approaching or assessing the city, because it's just our, I would say, excuse. Because once we adapt city to kids and their caregivers, we actually solve other problems as well for other users, elderly, people in need, etc. So I think for me, the women's perspective, because I'm not an expert in that, but I feel like it's an important exercise in which we try to adopt a different point of view very actively, as my colleagues showed better than I did, how actively we can use that point of view as an exercise to imagine different futures, and very concrete futures, ones that we can draw policy from, and not just nice words that we can discuss in panels. So for me, this is major. Maybe in the next few decades we will have another, I would say, perspective that will be more urgent for us. So for me, it's not that the women's perspective is the answer. It's a method into seeing differently and noticing differently, and therefore making a different policy.
James, you want to add something from your perspective?
Thank you, Mike. I suppose one quote from this last presentation was, what we're missing is not data, it's perspective, which made me think, in the context also of ADVA, your presentation, which was, I suppose, founded in quantitative data with a qualitative take. And I just wonder where that line sits between quantitative and qualitative analysis in a world where AI, quantity seems to dominate. And I suppose coming back to Mike, what you were saying in terms of spirit and feeling, how do we, if we cannot manage what we cannot measure, should we measure the qualitative, I suppose?
Anybody would like to relate to that? I see Eleanor is laughing on that one.
I'm happy you mentioned this, what we cannot quantify, we cannot manage, but I think it's something coming from many centuries ago. So nowadays, I wouldn't agree with this. Quite speaking about human relations, speaking about societal relations. So I think greater sensitivity to the qualitative side of life would be helpful in what we have to manage somehow. I'm just coming out of an evaluation process, and it was a meeting point of social scientists and experts in digital systems. And it was absolutely difficult to have, we tried on both sides. It was absolutely difficult to explain that sometimes social things and psychological things are not the ones that we should quantify and not the things that we should ask AI how to manage. This seems to me absolutely dangerous. If we cannot communicate among ourselves as human beings, then who needs us after all? We could leave the world to the AI and go somewhere else. So we have to try to find the way how this qualitative thing is, the qualitative aspect gets the recognition of being important in life and in managing life processes. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you both, James and Eleanor, for that dialogue. That was really, I think, it was a very important point. I don't think that we should come up with a decision, but I think that therefore it sort of evolves within ourselves and within the context by which we're then debating activities. Anyway, we've got 3 more minutes, but just to thank all 4 of you. Yes, it will be online, the activities. We'll discuss with Antonella and with Olivia regarding putting this the material, whether in fact 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of you are interested in some sort of publication. Adva's already mentioned that she's already on the horizon with the Built Heritage special edition. We are preparing another special edition with the Journal of Heritage Management. I forget it. It's the we'll be having a special edition, so there'll be another opportunity if any people are interested to actually make a proposal for a contribution, and there'll be more information in our next newsletter. Okay, so that's it. A wonderful 2 hours, and so great to see everybody again. And please note that we'll go for the global competition on linking culture and nature. We've also, all the Spanish-speaking Heritopolis people should register for the activity in Guadalajara. Very much recommended, and there'll also be participation in the World Urban Forum in May. I don't know whether people are interested or people will be there, but I see Ramon will be there. We will have our next consortium meeting on the last Wednesday, and that will be dedicated to Heritopolis Africa. So we will have then presentations essentially from our 3 executive members from Lagos, from Kigali, and from Mombasa, and this should be really an interesting cross-cultural debate. So again, thank you all, and have a great month. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.